Please join us in welcoming Chief Commercial Officer of Abra Group, Joe Mohan, in discussion with Skift Editor-in-Chief, Sarah Kopit.
So we just went north, now we're gonna go south,
yeah.
And Joe, I feel like I'm gonna have to ask you about food. So
you're asking the wrong guy.
Yeah. So, but you guys did pivot, and you have free food in economy and food in business class now, right? Did you find your NPS scores require that as well?
To a certain degree, yes. The feedback from the market.
Yeah.
You know, Avianca is similar to Gold now, entered Chapter 11. And so as we repositioned both of those airlines, the low-cost model, you know, I was told early in my career, you cannot control revenue. There's too many other factors. What is completely within your control is cost. And so I think in raising the capital, but not over-raising capital, getting to a world-leading unit cost level was critical for Avianca, and we were able to achieve that. And so as we looked at it, though, given what I can talk about on the top line, is that you have to be able to pivot. And I think the industry often chases, we in the CapEx cycle, we seem to be a year behind a trend. And so in this case, the densification of the aircraft was important, but they have a first-class, cabin. The meals were taken off. Those can easily be added back.
Yeah.
And so, when we look north to the United States, and there's a lot of talk about the product and, this focus on premium, it's really not that hard to add some food back if you feel that that's well justified and that can drive some revenue premium.
Do you have omelets?
I'm sorry?
Omelets.
Omelets,
Just
you
like
know what?
Canada.
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, I don't know what the equivalent of omelets would be in South America.
All right, so let's talk about markets. How about that? Like, what are market conditions like in LATAM? What's the demand like right now?
It's difficult to homogenize a region, right? I jokingly told you earlier, if Bill Gates and I are in the same room, on average, we're billionaires, right? And so what we see is that in the various markets, if you look at Latin American traffic, it behaves similarly to a mature market like North America, in that traffic will grow at roughly a 1-to-1 relationship to GDP. But within that, we see wild fluctuations within our markets. And because the demand and the pricing environment, et cetera, there's variables there that are different, right? And so, namely being inflation. We just went through an election here in the United States that, 4% inflation was, it was the most impactful issue, arguably. Yeah. Like most of the countries that we operate in, we would die for 4%. There was 200% inflation in Argentina last year. In the past few years, what we see is, close to 10% in Brazil. And so that has, when now you're pricing in that to a market that's much less elastic. To be able to stimulate, there's a low indice of travel, so you've got to have a low cost to be able to hit a price point to stimulate that traffic. But the ability to pass on that inflation, GDPs, are variable as well. And then lastly, just capacity. And so we were unable, in our case with Avianca, we grew traffic 20% last year, so great. Yeah. In the case of GOL, we're down. Why? Because we had to ground planes. We're in Chapter 11, and you can't fly people that you don't have the seats for. Yeah. So, the macros affect us much harder than I think they do up here.
And what about consolidation? How is that in the region?
Well, it's a fairly consolidated. If you think about the region overall, there's, let's say, south of Mexico. There's essentially, what I would consider three big groups. So there's Abra, that has an intra-Latin American as well as international, but more of a domestic focus in our existing airlines. LATAM, who went through a big merger several years ago, I guess about a decade ago, with a international as well as a regional footprint, and then Copa. So there is consolidation, but what we've seen is consolidation. Some of the issues that we can't solve, and right now, I would argue that Latin America has some of the best performing carriers in the world, based on what? Last year, Avianca was the #1 carrier in the world for on-time performance. That's the #1 thing. You want happy customers. You want to serve, higher yielding, demanding customers. Punctuality is #1. This year, I think GOL may actually do that. Both of those carriers have world-leading cost structures, and yet they both have gone through Chapter 11, right? Recently, GOL is in restructuring as we speak. Similarly, it's public knowledge that we've been in discussions with Azul. Azul runs a really good airline, and yet both of us find, and they're restructuring broadly outside of Chapter 11, but they're in deep restructuring as well. So these capital structures, as we look at what are the things that drive our costs, what are the things that drive our revenue, a cost of capital, we compete for the same aircraft that Southwest or United, and lessors can choose between those. And so, cost of capital, cost of leases tend to be 20 to 40% higher. Could that be reduced through consolidation to more competitive? We compete for MROs, et cetera. So, I think there is a solution, but really in the end, what we want is we want a healthy industry.
Yeah.
And if this is one form to get us there, we need to pursue it.
So we've talked about a lot of government-leaning things here. We've talked about bankruptcy. We've talked about inflation. We've talked, about omelets. Never mind.
That's omelets. Yeah, I didn't take the bait. I didn't take the bait on that one.
I'm curious, if you could pick a regulation or a tax, maybe scheme or structure to get rid of overnight, just wave your wand, what would it be?
Well, I'm seem to be talking a lot about Brazil, but it's probably the most difficult environment from a regulatory standpoint. But I'll happy to share some other ones as well. In Brazil, the cost of fuel runs about 30% higher than the rest of the world, so heavily taxed. And like I said, the inability, we can't pass that on. It's just inelastic. So the taxation of that. One of the craziest thing, and someone will need to fact check me on this, but I heard that of lawsuits to airlines, that 90% of those happen in Brazil. So when you are traveling, there's a lawsuit for every other flight is the statistic that I saw. And what are those? The coffee was too hot. It can be a multitude of things, but the consumer protection laws are so deep in Brazil. And there's literally, you get off a plane, you're going through the airport, there's a place where you can go file your lawsuit, like the government has. This is a hard business. Think about it. It's the best you can do. Or the world class is 90% on time. I mean, a 10% failure rate. That you're opening yourself up to some some litigation when that's the best you can do. So those would I think those things would be helpful.
Why? Why in Brazil is it so like that? What is it, a cultural thing? That's just an outstanding statistic.
I don't know. Do we have any Brazilians?
Any Brazilians?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. I don't want to speak on behalf of the Brazilian people. Yeah. I don't feel equipped. There's a lot of consumer protection. Yeah, in Brazil.
Yeah. So what about airport infrastructure? Do you think that there's enough spending on that in the region?
Yeah, I don't know. Willie can probably better talk to this in the afternoon. But it's, I think in Latin America, government, you get government involved, right? And for reasons, many reasons, overbuilding. I think people love to overbuild. And so, fit for purpose, where, this is working closely with an airline, and I've only really seen governments, in this particular case in infrastructure, really work with the local, call it flag airline, and that was in Panama. And I think that you see the fruits of that, and how COPA has been able to grow. But in many other places, it's either too much or too little. And I think on the too much side is that, we overbuilt, now you need to pay us this amount. And again, this goes back to you're getting a debt level, you're getting a cost level to the point where, you price a lot of people out of the market. But from an infrastructure standpoint, the facilities are sufficient. I don't think that is the main issue that we have as an airline industry and growing more.
So let's talk about the low-cost model. It's struggling a bit here in the US. We've talked a lot about that today. How is it doing in LATAM? Is that a good place for the low-cost structure?
Yeah, so I would like to think we were a little bit out ahead of this.
Yeah.
Is that, we went low cost, right?
Yeah.
But, what I talked about is given these tremendous amount of variables that, an economy can go this way, think about Central America. Central America is about 35 million inhabitants. That's about the size of California. But you're dealing with 8 different governments, right? And so any one of those could come up with something that changes. You have to adapt your business model. And so, I talked earlier about chasing a cycle. I think as much as trying to predict whether we should be low cost, whether we should be this, or whether we should be that, is that we have to have a flexible model to adapt quickly. And so with the densification of our product, we can get to a CAS that's good. But, as someone once told me, smiles are free, right? Like you can provide an incredible service that doesn't cost a thing. And so we pride ourselves on service. And the on-time performance, I think when people think of low cost, there's a cost to having an on-time product. You have to have a certain amount of spares. You might have, a little bit more slack in your block times and things like that. So we're very much, I would say, catered to a demanding kind of, call it, higher yielding passenger. But we do have the flexibility with, the densification, with the ability to, like our first 3 seats in Avianca's case, but it's similar in Goals International, is, they're 2 seats. And, there's a little space between you. So it's somewhat of a hybrid, call it business class, right? If you needed to go low cost, if the market demanded that, you're just switching out those first 3 rows. You have that flexibility. So, we can pivot, but we also never got rid of our loyalty programs, and I'm sure we'll talk about that more.
Yeah.
But the loyalty, if Brazil, like you go to Brazil and soccer is king, like loyalty is queen because people like go crazy over loyalty, and it's both loyalty for loyalty's sake, but also as a program for our most important travelers.
Yeah. So why is that? How important is loyalty in Brazil?
Well, so I heard earlier, cited on the KL Air France, the presentation on their loyalty program. Like this is cash, yeah. Right? Like people are breaking out these P&Ls today, and I think that. We are both of these companies now as we emerge from Chapter 11 and we have, 5-year plans that we need to execute against. Make no bones about it, is that this is a cash component that drives something where it's very necessary. But the loyalty aspect of it, right? And so one of the great examples I would give of Abra and what we're trying to do to bring 2 brands together. We didn't merge. We didn't, go through that pain of doing that. Yeah. We maintained two broadly, independent operating companies. Is how can we surprise and delight our customers? And so something as simple as the reciprocal tier benefits, something that would be akin to, Star or what the global alliances would offer, the priority services, the lounges, going back to, are we low cost? We have lounges. That now that, hey, I am in a diamond on Smiles, and I can walk into an Avianca lounge. Yeah. And so, we want to continue to roll these out and surprise and delight.
So just a reminder for the audience, if you got any questions for Joe, please send them in, get out your app. We'd love to hear questions from you. But going back to Abra for a minute, you purchased Wamos recently. What does that say about your fleet strategy?
So I think it's another example of flexibility, of business model flexibility. The first slide that was up there, one of the what we've seen in Latin America, and this probably has largely something to do with cost of capital, but the majority, so let's look at Europe as an example. The majority of the bookings between Latin America and Europe originate in Latin America. But when you look at the disproportional amount of capacity, it's 2/3 of the capacity is served from the other side. And so, as we looked at that, we said, okay, there might be an opportunity for some wide body long haul flying. Now, going back to my example of Central America, but you now have independent, you have independent countries where you may need to get an operating certificate. Right. To be able to operate from those, even though those are places where we have a great brand presence. So what Wamos allows us to do, number one, is that they're an ACMI business in a time where it's a really good time to be in the ACMI business. So it can produce income to the parent in and of itself, but it also provides us that flexibility that if we want to operate it as a regularly scheduled carrier, we have the point of sale strength on the other side, and we could operate those aircraft to multiple different countries within Latin America, solve some of that capacity disbalance. So really, really nice tool. We're excited about it, and hopefully we'll do something interesting with it here soon. All
right, so ask and you shall receive. Lots of questions from the audience coming in. You have any comment on news that Avianca might purchase Aerolíneas Argentinas?
So I'm glad to see these questions. Like I woke up in the middle of the night going, man, there's not going to be one question. It's going to be so boring. so thank you. All right, so Aerolíneas Argentinas. Aerolíneas has been bought and sold many times over a few decades. In fact, I did due diligence on that. One of my first jobs at Continental Airlines 25 years ago. What is there to sell? We don't really know. In fact, and so they have opened up. Argentina has opened up to they intend to go open skies, and so. What is already a very damaged carrier now is looking down the barrel of a lot more competition. So we are interested in Aerolíneas, but what exactly Aerolíneas represents at this point, we're in the due diligence to figure out.
Another question: given the different countries and cultures in LATAM, how do you create CX that reflects various cultures and generates the loyalty Smiles seeks?
Yeah, I think that's at the core of maintaining the brands. Right? It is. You talk to a person. It is a bunch of countries separated by a common language, and you can go halfway, just on the same island of Dominican Republic, you have Haiti and you have the Dominican Republic. I mean, this is a small geographic area with very diverse cultures, languages. And so I think being respectful of that is that we didn't believe that, a one company would be able to address something where Avianca has operated in Central America. Previous to that is TACA. Know Central America well, then Colombia, and Brazil, largest aviation market. And, so I think we've addressed it through our brands, and that's why we want them to operate independently.
So same question, just about labor laws. How do you navigate all these different countries and all their different laws?
A bunch of lawyers.
Yeah, all right, enough said. Enough said on that. Okay, last
Legal
question.
expenses go high.
Yeah. Is there one airport in Latin America that you consider to be the model of efficiency?
Oh, gosh, no, it's like your cell phone provider. You know, they're all horrible. Just, you know, the one you have is worse than the other one.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. I mean, we work closely with ours, but there is always a lot of room to do better. Yeah.
All right, so we are going to leave it with that. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thanks so much.